Welcome to this short informational video produced by CPRE Oxfordshire, which aims to give you an overview of considerations when assessing a planning application situated within the Oxford Green Belt. I'll briefly first outline the history of the Green Belt concept, the location of Oxford Green Belt, and then go on to discuss what legislation and specific policies should be considered when an application within the Oxford Green Belt is being assessed. Let's firstly briefly look at the history of the Green Belt. It was a concept first introduced by Ebenezer Howard in 1902 to give protection and green space between city slum and industrial smog locations. The first legislation in relation to the Green Belt was introduced in 1955, with the original Green Belt policy in Circular 4255. It's interesting to see that this initial policy has stood the test of time and altered very little, the principle being that inside a green belt, approval for applications should not be given unless in very special circumstances. Looking at the Green Belt today, 12.6% of land in England is designated as Green Belt, and this falls in 14 areas. Green Belt land is protected from most forms of development by national and local policy. So let's go on to look at the Oxford Green Belt. We can see that it surrounds the city of Oxford, falling in all 5 of our county districts. It forms a protective circular area around the city with a strip running through the city itself. Looking at the statistics in a little more detail, there are 260,594 hectares of land in Oxfordshire, of which 34,464, or 13.2%, fall within the Oxford Green Belt. This is a 1.5% decline from 10 years ago due to development. So what policies protect the Green Belt? There is national policy enshrined in the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework. We have local plan policy, and sometimes the Green Belt is referred to in neighbourhood plan policy. These documents tend to be very large and many have multiple references to the Green Belt. So within this video, we're aiming to cover and point you to the key important policies. So let's first look at the NPPF, which was recently revised in December 2023 and sets out in paragraph 143 what it considers to be the 5 main purposes of the Green Belt. These being to restrict urban sprawl, prevent settlements from merging, protect the countryside, preserve the setting and character of historic towns, and encourage urban regeneration. There are different sets of policies covering the Green Belt in the NPPF. Paragraphs 144 to 151 cover Green Belt boundaries and grounds for alteration. These relate to strategic changes and developments, which you would find in your local plan. Paragraphs 152 to 156 go on to give policies which relate to considerations when planning applications come forward within the Green Belt. So there is a difference between how a strategic site coming forward in a local plan is assessed against how a planning application should be considered, and I'm going to discuss this. Firstly, let's look at paragraphs 144 to 151, covering Green Belt boundaries and grounds for alteration. The key words within these policies, which are mentioned in 144 and 145, are that the Green Belt policy can only be altered in exceptional circumstances. It goes on to say in paragraph 146 that before concluding that exceptional circumstances exist, an authority must justify that it's looked at all reasonable alternatives, these being suitable brownfield sites, optimisation of density on other sites, and whether neighbouring authorities could accommodate the need. CPRE's view is that exceptional must truly be exceptional, by which we mean it must clearly be in the public interest and only able to achieve its purpose if delivered within the Green Belt. The next sections of policies, 152 to 156, refer to assessing a planning application in the Green Belt. And I'm going to highlight in red what I consider to be the important terms in these policies. 152 states, inappropriate development is by definition harmful to the Green Belt and should not be approved except in very special circumstances. 153 goes on to say, when considering any planning application, local planning authorities should ensure that substantial weight is given to any harm to the Green Belt. Very special circumstances will not exist unless the potential harm to the Green Belt by reason of inappropriateness and any other harm resulting from the proposal is clearly outweighed by other considerations. And finally, paragraph 154 states a local planning authority should regard the construction of new buildings as inappropriate in the Green Belt. There are specific exceptions to this, and I'll go on to talk about those later. Moving on, paragraph 155 then goes on to discuss developments which are not inappropriate, so long as they preserve the openness and do not conflict with the 5 purposes of the Green Belt. I'm not going to go through each of these, but feel free to pause the video if you want to review them. Paragraph 156 talks about renewable energy projects. This is particularly relevant in our county as we see numerous solar farm developments coming forward. It states that developers must demonstrate that very special circumstances exist, but goes on to say these may include wider environmental benefits associated with the increased production of energy from renewable sources. As this possible exception is mentioned specifically, it does make applications harder to defend and the need greater for a county-wide renewables plan, which puts brownfield sites and rooftops as the first priority for solar. The phrasing of these policies are subjective, somewhat of a lawyer's paradise to argue over. There are some really key terms here I'm going to discuss further and give you examples of them. Firstly, let's look at very special circumstances. It's widely agreed that the meaning remains unaltered from when it was first introduced in 1955. The 5 aims of the Green Belt must be considered and upheld. This was agreed and is often now cited in the case adjudicated by the Right Honourable Mr. Justice Dove in the case Atkins versus Tunbridge City Council in 2015, where there was a challenge to the granting of a planning permission for a motocross circuit in the Green Belt. It is also the case that proving very special circumstances is a stronger, more stringent test than proving exceptional circumstances. There must be more than one exceptional circumstance to meet a very special circumstance test. Developers will often cite unmet housing need, particularly for affordable housing in Oxford City, to be a case for very special circumstances. However, there's also guidance here, with this being cited as unlikely to outweigh harm and constitute very special circumstances. But it could be a circumstance along with other considerations which could meet the threshold. But a developer citing unmet housing need alone is unlikely to outweigh harm in the Green Belt. Let's go on to consider the term substantial weight. It is widely agreed that substantial weight is greater than significant weight, and there is some precedent from Sajid Javid's comments in 2016, where he states that an out-of-date neighbourhood plan should be given very substantial weight. Going on to consider the phrase clearly outweighed, it's agreed that material considerations must clearly, not marginally, outweigh potential harm to the green belt. There's an example of where this was proved to be true, where the Secretary of State did grant planning permission for 500 homes, the benefit of which he considered did clearly outweigh the loss of a very small amount of woodland, as there were multiple benefits. And finally, the phrase inappropriate. There was a key ruling in 2016 where development that is not in principle inappropriate was considered appropriate in the green belt, and that exceptions, by their very inclusion, are considered appropriate. However, I would point out that even if a development falls into a green belt exception, there may be other policies within the local plan that apply and could defeat it. So let's go on to look at what these exceptions are, and there are only 7 of them. I'll take you through these fairly swiftly, but again, do pause the video if you'd like to review them. They are buildings for agriculture or forestry, provision for certain facilities, extensions or alterations of a building, replacement of a building, limited village infill, limited affordable housing, and finally, redevelopment of previously developed land. So just to recap, unless the development falls under one of these 7 specific categories, it is otherwise deemed to be inappropriate. Let's go on to look at the local plans. And I'm going to take these by district in turn. Firstly, looking at Cherwell. The main Greenbelt policy here is policy ESD 14, and it states that the policy upholds MPPF policy and makes some provision for a review around Kidlington. It states further small-scale review of the Greenbelt boundary will only be undertaken where exceptional circumstances can be demonstrated. Looking at West Oxfordshire, their policy OS2 covers Greenbelt, and it very clearly states at the start that all development in the Greenbelt should comply with national policy in the MPPF. Looking at the Oxford City Plan to 2036, page 19 talks of the key elements of the strategy within this plan. Here the council considers that exceptional circumstances did exist to justify a Greenbelt boundary review due to Oxford's economic success and the additional housing need. The plan allocated 8 sites in the Greenbelt for development. But it goes on to say in policy G3 that other than these redesignated sites, proposals for the Greenbelt will be determined in accordance with national policy. The emerging latest draft Oxford local plan, which is currently at the inspector's review, has large housing numbers but does not put any further development in the Greenbelt. The Vale of Whitehorse plan in 2031 has 2 parts to it. In part 1 of the plan, the Greenbelt is referred to in policy 13. It states that the Greenbelt will continue to be protected to maintain its openness and permanence, but development will be permitted in named settlements, and it goes on to name these. During 2019-20, there were 26 permissions granted for development in the Greenbelt. These were all granted in line with this core policy 13 and considered to be appropriate development in the Greenbelt. Part 2 of the Vale of Whitehorse local plan has a further policy 13A, which refers to the green belt and is amended to reflect the additional site of Dalton Barracks. However, the emerging draft joint South Oxfordshire and Vale of Whitehorse local plan shows no further development within the green belt. Finally, looking at South Oxfordshire. Strategy 6 refers to the green belt, and its policy is very much supportive and in line with national policy, quoting many of the NPPF key phrases. And as I mentioned before, the joint South Oxfordshire and Vale of Whitehorse local plan, which is emerging, has no further development in the green belt. You also need to look at neighbourhood plans and see if there are any rural exception sites or any other references to the green belt. And I would suggest that you can use the search tool for the word green belt in any of these plans. I haven't gone through them in detail due to their numbers. So let's just conclude. When considering in the Oxford Green Belt, what should you be looking for? Well, following NPPF and local plan, your starting position should be reject with these considerations. If it is a strategic site proposed in the local plan, are exceptional circumstances proved? If they're not, it should be rejected. Does the proposal demonstrate very special circumstances? If not, reject. Is the building inappropriate? It is inappropriate unless it meets one of the 7 specific exceptions. Will this proposal harm the 5 purposes of the green belt? If it will, you should give this substantial weight and reject. Is this potential harm clearly outweighed by other considerations? If not, reject. Just to reiterate CPRE Oxfordshire's view, we believe that exceptional must really be exceptional, and any development in the green belt must be clearly in the public interest and only able to achieve its purpose if delivered within the green belt. Thank you so much for spending the time to watch this video, and we hope you found it informative. If you'd like to know more about the work of CPRE Oxfordshire or discuss anything with us, please do get in touch, as we'd love to hear from you.